The cold pavement became his bed, the empty road his only view. He waited. Days turned to years. Forgotten. Alone. Until fate intervened in a way no one could have imagined. The house had once been full of warmth. Now, it was just a hollow shell, a ghost of the life it once held. The wooden porch creaked in the cold wind, its paint chipped and peeling, the windows dusty and empty. No lights, no voices, no laughter. The heart of this home had vanished, leaving only silence behind. And in that silence, Rex waited. A German shepherd with a thick, once glossy coat, now dulled by dirt and dust. His powerful frame, which had once raced across the yard with boundless energy, had withered, his ribs pressing faintly against his skin. His eyes, a deep and intelligent brown, scanned the road every morning, every evening, waiting for something, someone, that would never return. The boy, Evan, had once been his whole world. They had grown up together, side by side. Rex had been there when Evan took his first wobbly steps, when he scraped his knee on the sidewalk, when he cried over broken toys. And every night, before bed, Evan would press his small hands against Rex's fur, whispering, "Good night, buddy. See you in the morning." But the mornings were different now. Evan wasn't here. Neither was his mother, whose gentle hands had ruffled his ears each day, or his father, who always clapped him on the side after a long day's work, calling him a good boy. They had packed the house, filled boxes, loaded furniture. The scent of change had been in the air, thick and suffocating. Rex had watched them carry their belongings out the door, one by one, his tail wagging, expecting to be part of the journey. But the door had closed. The car had driven away, and Rex had been left behind. At first he had run after them. His powerful legs carried him down the asphalt road, his ears pinned back against the rushing wind. His nails scraped against the pavement as he pushed himself harder, faster. But they were faster. The dust settled. The road stretched empty before him. The scent of his family faded with every breath. Still, he had waited. Days turned to weeks. Hunger gnawed at his belly, but the pain of abandonment was worse. Each morning, he limped back to the road, ears pricked, waiting. Each night, he curled up against the cold doorstep, trying to remember the warmth of a home that no longer existed. The wind carried unfamiliar scents now, strangers walking past, their eyes flicking toward him with brief sympathy before hurrying along. Some tossed scraps his way, half-eaten sandwiches or discarded bones. Others avoided him altogether, crossing the street when they saw his hollow frame and sunken eyes. He was invisible, except to one person. It happened on an evening when the sky was painted in deep shades of violet and gold, the sun sinking into the horizon like an ember fading into the dark. The sound of footsteps approached, soft, hesitant. A girl. She was young, no older than Evan had been, with tangled brown hair and wide, searching eyes. Her clothes were frayed, her shoes worn down, and her face bore the kind of weariness that didn't belong to a child. She stopped a few feet away, her gaze locking onto his. She didn't look at him like the others did. There was no quick glance, no pity before moving on. She stayed. "Hey, boy," she whispered, crouching low. Her voice was soft, uncertain. Rex didn't move. Humans came and went. If he stayed still, maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't go. Slowly, she reached into her bag and pulled out something wrapped in paper. The scent hit him like a memory. Meat. Warm, rich, food. His stomach clenched painfully. She tossed the food toward him, a careful distance away, as if understanding that trust could not be forced. Rex hesitated. Trust had failed him before. The ones he had given his heart to had driven away without looking back. But hunger was stronger than fear. Cautiously, he stepped forward, his legs trembling. His nose brushed against the paper, the scent overwhelming his senses. His mouth watered as he unwrapped it, teeth sinking into soft, cooked beef. He ate. She watched. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't alone. The girl sat cross-legged on the cracked sidewalk, watching him in silence. She made no sudden movements, no gestures to chase him away. When he finished, he licked his muzzle and stared at her, unsure what to do next. She smiled. It was small, barely there, but it was real. "You're just like me," she said softly. He tilted his head. She pulled her knees to her chest, resting her chin on them. "No home." A pause. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "No family." The wind rustled between them. Rex lowered himself onto his belly, resting his head on his paws. He didn't understand her words, but he understood her. Loneliness had a scent. It clung to the skin, soaked into the bones, and she smelled just like him. The girl stayed until the last of the sunlight disappeared, until the streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows over the empty house. Then slowly, she stood. Rex lifted his head. She hesitated, then reached into her bag again, pulling out a torn piece of cloth. She placed it gently on the porch beside him. "I'll come back tomorrow," she murmured. And then she was gone. Rex stared at the cloth, a small, insignificant thing, carrying the faint scent of her. A promise. For the first time in weeks, he didn't look toward the road. Instead, he curled up beside the scrap of fabric, his tail resting over it, and closed his eyes. Maybe tomorrow wouldn't be so empty after all. The next morning was eerily quiet. The storm had passed, leaving behind the scent of damp earth and fresh rain, but it had taken something with it: the girl. Rex lifted his head from the porch, stretching his stiff legs. His fur was still damp from the night before, clumped together in muddy patches. His stomach clenched painfully, but hunger was not the only thing gnawing at him. She had promised. She said she would come back. He rose to his feet, shaking himself off, his ears pricked toward the road. His nose twitched, searching for any trace of her scent in the cool morning air. But the street was empty. His paws moved before he could think. He stepped off the porch, something inside him whispering that if he waited any longer, she would disappear forever, just like they did. His family, the ones who had left him behind. But she was different. She had come back before. She had fed him, sat with him, touched him with kindness when no one else had. And now she was gone. Rex patted down the wet pavement, nose low to the ground, following the faintest traces of her scent. It was weak, almost lost to the rain, but it was there. And so, he followed. The trail led him past houses he had never seen, streets unfamiliar to him. For the first time in his life, he left the only home he had ever known. Rex didn't belong to this world of moving cars and towering buildings. The city had always been something beyond his small universe, something he watched from the safety of his yard. But the girl had stepped into his world, and now he was stepping into hers. The deeper he went, the sharper the scents became. Oil, garbage, distant food. The ground beneath his paws turned from dirt to concrete, and the sky overhead seemed further away, swallowed by buildings that loomed like giants. His ears twitched at every honk, every shout, but he kept moving. She was close. Then, a scent. Stronger than before. Clearer. Her. Rex's ears perked. He turned a corner, nose to the ground, tail low and stiff. The alley was narrow, tucked between two old buildings, littered with trash and the damp remains of last night's storm. And there, curled beneath a tattered blanket, was the girl. She wasn't moving. Rex let out a soft whine, stepping closer. Her arms were wrapped around herself, her knees pulled to her chest, her small body trembling with cold. He nudged her arm with his nose. She flinched, eyes snapping open in alarm. But when she saw him, something in her face softened. "Hey, boy," she rasped, her voice rough from cold and exhaustion. Rex let out a low whimper, nudging her again. She shivered. "I'm okay," she murmured. She wasn't. Her skin was too pale, her fingers trembling as she weakly reached out. Rex pressed his body against her, his warmth seeping into her bones. She let out a breath, a shaky, fragile thing. Then, slowly, she leaned into him. "I guess we're both strays now, huh?" she whispered. Rex closed his eyes. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't just waiting for someone to return. For the first time, he had found someone to stay for. They stayed like that for hours, huddled against the cold, Rex curled protectively around her small frame. But even as the morning stretched into afternoon, something inside him remained uneasy. She was too weak, too cold. She wasn't like him, built for survival, made to endure hunger and harsh weather. She needed help. Rex lifted his head, ears twitching at the distant hum of the city. He didn't know where to find help, didn't understand the world beyond his home, but he knew someone had to be out there. The girl stirred beside him, shifting beneath the blanket. "Don't go," she murmured, barely awake. Rex whined, licking her hand. He would come back. He had to. With one last look, he stepped away. And then he ran. And the city was loud. The sounds of honking cars, distant voices, and rolling tires filled the air, overwhelming his senses. Rex weaved through the streets, dodging between moving legs, his breath coming fast and hard. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to find someone. Then, a voice. "Hey, dog!" Rex skidded to a stop. A man was watching him, standing near a small food cart, a sandwich half-eaten in his hand. Rex's stomach growled painfully, but food wasn't why he was here. He barked. The man raised an eyebrow. "What? You hungry?" Rex barked again, stepping forward, then back, motioning for him to follow. The man frowned. "What's up with you?" Rex let out a sharp, urgent bark, lowering his front paws as if pleading. The man hesitated, and then Rex turned and ran. He didn't stop to look back. He only ran. He found his way back to the alley, breathless, his heart pounding. The girl was still there, curled in the same spot, her breath slow and uneven. Rex whined, pacing anxiously. Then, footsteps. The man. His voice reached them before he did. "Whoa! Hey, kid!" The girl stirred, eyes fluttering open. She flinched when she saw him, trying to sit up, but her body was too weak. The man crouched beside her, hands raised in surrender. "Hey, easy, easy. I'm not going to hurt you. Your dog dragged me here." She blinked, dazed. "He's not my dog," she mumbled. The man glanced at Rex, then back at her. "Could have fooled me." Rex sat beside her, watching closely. "How long have you been out here?" the man asked gently. She didn't answer. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "All right, kid. I know a shelter not too far from here. It's warm. They've got food." The girl stiffened. "No shelters," she whispered. The man hesitated. Then, softer. "Okay. No shelters. But you can't stay out here." Rex nudged her hand with his nose. She looked at him, at his patient, waiting eyes, and for the first time, she didn't feel so alone. She let out a breath. "Okay," she whispered. The man helped her to her feet, steadying her as she swayed. "Easy. You got a name, kid?" She hesitated, then, barely above a whisper, "Lena." The man nodded. "All right, Lena, let's get you somewhere warm." She turned to Rex, fingers curling weakly into his fur. "You coming, boy?" Rex let out a soft chuff, pressing against her side. He wasn't going anywhere, and this time, neither was she. The walk was slow. Lena's legs trembled with every step, her body weak from days of cold and hunger. The man, he had introduced himself as Daniel, kept a careful pace beside her, watching her from the corner of his eye. Rex pressed close to her side, steady and warm. Every time she stumbled, his solid form was there to catch her. The city moved around them, people passing without a second glance. No one noticed the girl in tattered clothes, her cheeks hollow, her lips cracked from cold. No one saw the German shepherd walking beside her, lean and scarred from weeks of survival. No one looked, but Daniel had. "You've been out here a while, haven't you?" he asked as they crossed a street. Lena didn't answer. She kept her eyes on the sidewalk, watching her feet move forward, one after the other. One step, then another. Rex glanced up at her, ears flicking forward. "She's quiet, huh?" Daniel muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Rex let out a low chuff. Daniel sighed. "All right, kid, no pressure. Let's just get you somewhere safe." Safe. The word felt foreign to her. Lena had spent so long running, so long hiding, that the idea of safety felt more like a memory than something real. And yet, she kept walking. Because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone. And neither was Rex. They stopped at a small diner on the edge of town, tucked between an old laundromat and a corner store with flickering neon lights. The place smelled like coffee and grilled cheese, like warmth and something close to home. Daniel held the door open. "Come on." Lena hesitated. She had been turned away from places like this before, chased off sidewalks, ignored. But Rex stepped inside without fear, his tail low but wagging. He trusted this, trusted them. Lena took a breath and followed. The warmth hit her like a wave, sinking into her frozen limbs. Her fingers ached as they thawed, the heat stinging at first before easing into something bearable. Daniel led them to a booth in the back. "Sit," he said. Lena did. Rex curled up at her feet, his large body resting against her legs, a steady presence beneath the table. A waitress approached, her expression wary until Daniel gave her a nod. "Can we get something hot? Soup, maybe?" The woman glanced at Lena, then at Rex. Her lips pressed together like she wanted to say something, maybe to tell them to leave, but instead she sighed. "Yeah, I got something." Lena didn't look up. She didn't breathe until the woman walked away. Daniel leaned back in his seat, folding his arms. "You got anywhere to go?" Lena shook her head. "Family?" She stared at the table. Silence. Rex lifted his head, sensing the tension in the air. Daniel sighed. "All right." He didn't push, didn't demand answers she wasn't ready to give. The soup came a few minutes later. Hot, thick, steaming. A side of bread, a glass of water. Lena hesitated for only a second before reaching for the spoon. The first sip burned her throat, but she didn't care. She ate slowly, carefully, as if afraid it would disappear if she moved too fast. Rex watched, ears twitching every time she lifted the spoon. He didn't beg, didn't move, but she knew he was hungry too. She tore off a piece of bread and held it out beneath the table. He took it gently, chewing with slow appreciation. Daniel watched the exchange, but said nothing. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice quieter now. "I don't know what happened to you, kid, but I know what it's like to have nowhere to go." Lena swallowed hard. Daniel sat back. "You don't have to tell me anything. You don't have to trust me. But I know a place, somewhere warm, somewhere safe. You can sleep, eat, figure out your next move." Lena stiffened. A shelter. She had been in shelters before. She knew what happened when the wrong people asked too many questions. She knew how easy it was to disappear. "No," she said, voice barely above a whisper. Daniel didn't argue. He just nodded. "Okay." Rex nudged her knee. She ran her fingers through his fur, grounding herself. Safe. The word still felt too big, too heavy. But for the first time in a long time, she wanted to believe it was possible. They stayed in the diner for over an hour. Lena ate. Rex rested. Daniel talked about nothing in particular. The city, the weather, a dog he used to have when he was younger. He filled the space with something other than silence. And for once, Lena let herself listen. When the sky darkened, Daniel stood. "All right, kid. Where to?" Lena hesitated. She didn't have a place. But the thought of going back to the alley, of curling up in the cold again, made her stomach twist. Her fingers curled into Rex's fur. Daniel watched her, then sighed. "You can stay with me tonight," he said finally. "I got a couch. It's nothing fancy, but it's warm." Lena blinked at him. "Just one night," he added. "No pressure, no strings, just a roof and a locked door." A locked door. Something inside her cracked at the thought. Rex nudged her again, as if telling her it was okay. Lena exhaled. "Okay." Daniel gave a short nod, then gestured for them to follow. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Lena walked toward something instead of away. Daniel's place was small, cluttered, but clean. The couch was old, the cushions lumpy, but when Lena sat down, it felt like heaven. Rex hopped up beside her, curling against her side. Daniel tossed her a blanket. "Get some sleep, kid." She didn't respond, didn't move. Because for the first time in years, she felt safe enough to close her eyes. And so she did. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she slept.
Lena woke to the smell of coffee. It was warm, rich, familiar. For a brief moment, she thought she was back home, before everything had fallen apart. Before the fights, before the running, before she had become a ghost in a city that never stopped moving. But then the ache in her limbs reminded her. She wasn't home. She was on a couch, wrapped in a blanket that wasn't hers, in a stranger's apartment. And yet, she wasn't afraid. Rex was still there, curled beside her, his steady breathing a quiet reassurance. Lena sat up slowly. Her body protested, stiff from exhaustion, but the pain was duller than before. She rubbed her eyes and looked around. Daniel was in the kitchen, pouring coffee into a chipped mug. He glanced over his shoulder. "Morning, kid." Lena swallowed, her throat dry. "Morning." Daniel set the coffee down and motioned toward a plate on the counter. "Figured you'd be hungry." Lena hesitated, but her stomach growled before she could argue. She pushed herself off the couch, padding toward the small kitchen. Toast, scrambled eggs, an apple, sliced into careful pieces. She hadn't seen a plate this full in... she couldn't remember. She sat at the counter. Rex rested his head on her lap. Daniel didn't speak as she ate. He sipped his coffee, leaning against the sink, watching the morning unfold through the small window. The silence wasn't heavy. It wasn't waiting. It just was. Lena let herself breathe. She finished the last bite of toast, wiped her hands on her jeans, then softly, "Thank you." Daniel nodded, but didn't look at her. "You're welcome." Lena hesitated. She didn't know what to say next, didn't know what came next. And then, a knock at the door. Rex's head snapped up, his ears pricked forward, his body tensing beneath Lena's fingers. Daniel frowned, setting his coffee down. The knock came again, louder this time. Lena felt it in her chest, a familiar dread, curling like smoke in her lungs. Daniel wiped his hands on his jeans and moved toward the door. "Relax," he murmured. "It's probably just..." He pulled it open and froze. Lena knew. Before she even saw who it was, she knew. A voice, sharp and too familiar. "You've got something that belongs to me." Lena's breath turned to ice. Rex let out a low, dangerous growl. She turned, and there he was, her father. Daniel didn't move, didn't step back. He just stood there, staring at the man on his doorstep. Lena felt like the world had tilted, like the ground had been yanked out from under her feet. Her father. He looked the same. Same sunken eyes, same unshaven face, same tension in his shoulders that never seemed to leave. But his voice, that voice sent her back. Back to cold nights and locked doors. Back to waiting, waiting for the moment he would lash out. Back to the moment she realized she had to run.
"She's not yours," Daniel said, his voice calm but edged with steel. Her father's eyes flicked past him, locking onto her. Lena felt her breath catch. A smile, small, thin, the kind that never reached his eyes. "There you are, kid," Rex growled, his body tense beneath Lena's hand. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her father tilted his head. "What, you think you can just run off? Think you can hide?" Daniel took a step forward, blocking the doorway. "I don't know what you think this is, but she's not going anywhere with you." Her father chuckled. It was a terrible sound. "And who the hell are you?" "Someone who doesn't let kids get dragged back into bad situations." Her father's jaw clenched, his hands curled into fists. Lena's stomach twisted. She knew that look. She had seen it too many times before. Daniel didn't back down. Her father exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "This isn't your business." Daniel crossed his arms. "You made it my business when you came to my door." A beat of silence. Lena's pulse thundered in her ears. Then, her father smiled again. "You know what? Fine." He raised his hands, stepping back. "Keep her." His eyes flicked to Lena. "See how long you last on your own, kid." Lena flinched. Then, just like that. He turned, walked away, the door closed. Silence. Lena sat frozen, waiting, because it was never that easy. Her father never walked away, not without a reason. Daniel turned, running a hand through his hair. "Well, that was fun." Lena stared at the door, breath shallow. Rex leaned into her, warm and steady. Daniel exhaled. "You okay?" Lena blinked, swallowed hard, nodded. It was a lie. Daniel sighed. "Yeah, me neither." He moved to the window, peering out. "He's still out there," he muttered. "Not leaving any time soon." Lena clenched her fists. Of course he wasn't. He was waiting for her to break, for her to come back. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Daniel turned to her. "We'll figure this out, kid." Lena barely heard him. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "See how long you last on your own." And suddenly, she wasn't cold, she wasn't scared, she was angry. Her father had spent years making her feel small, making her feel like she needed him, like she would never survive without him. But she had. She had run. She had survived the streets, the cold, the hunger. She had found Rex. She had made it this far, and she wasn't going back. Not now. Not ever. She stood. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Lena?" She turned to him. "He won't leave," she said quietly. "Not unless we make him." Daniel studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he smiled. Rex lifted his head. His ears pricked forward. Lena met his eyes, and for the first time, she didn't feel like a runaway. She felt like something more, something stronger, something unbreakable. She had spent her whole life running, but now she was ready to fight. Lena stood in the dimly lit apartment, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, the weight of everything pressed against her chest, her father outside, the past clawing at her, the future uncertain. But she wasn't running this time. She met Daniel's gaze. "He won't just leave." Daniel studied her carefully. Number he won't. She swallowed, her throat dry. "I have to end this." Rex let out a soft whine and pressed his body against her leg. Daniel exhaled. "All right, kid, what's the plan?" Lena glanced at the door. Her father was still out there, lurking like a shadow from her past, waiting for her to break. He was always waiting. He thought she was still the scared little girl who wouldn't fight back. But he was wrong. She had survived. She had learned how to stand on her own, even when the world tried to crush her. She turned back to Daniel. "I need to talk to him." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Lena, I need to." Her voice was steady, unshaken. "I have to look him in the eye and tell him I'm not his anymore." Daniel studied her for a long moment. Then, with a slow nod, he stepped aside. "I'll be right here." Lena turned to Rex. His deep brown eyes held nothing but trust. He had followed her through the cold, through the hunger, through everything. He had been abandoned, too. But together they had survived. And now they were facing this together. She took a breath, placed a steadying hand on Rex's head, then turned and unlocked the door. The night was cool, the air thick with the scent of the city, gasoline, distant food stalls, the faint bite of rain from the storm that had passed. Her father stood a few feet away, leaning against a lamppost, arms crossed over his chest. When she stepped outside, he straightened. "There you are," he murmured, his voice smooth, coaxing, like always. "Took you long enough." Lena's stomach curled, but she held her ground. Rex stood beside her, his body tense, ears forward, ready. Her father took a step closer. "You done playing house?" Lena didn't move. "I'm not going back with you." A flicker of amusement crossed his face. "Yeah?" He tilted his head. "And where exactly do you think you're gonna go?" "I don't need you." The words felt like fire on her tongue, a truth she had never dared to say out loud. Her father's expression darkened. "You think you're grown now, huh? Think you can survive without me?" She lifted her chin. "I already have." The silence between them was thick, heavy. Then her father laughed, a short, sharp sound. "You got lucky," he muttered. "That's all. You wouldn't last another week out here." Lena stared at him, at the man who had once held complete control over her life. And now? He looked small. She had feared him for so long, convinced he held the key to her survival. But now, standing in front of him, she realized he had never been her lifeline. She had saved herself. Rex let out a low growl, and her father took a step back. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Lena took a breath. "Leave." His jaw tightened. "Lena, I said leave." He hesitated. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Lena didn't move, not until his footsteps faded completely. Then, finally, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Rex nudged her leg, and she sank down beside him, burying her face in his fur. She had won. For the first time in her life, she was free. Daniel didn't say anything when she walked back inside. He didn't need to. Instead, he set another blanket on the couch, poured her a cup of warm tea, and left her to sit with her thoughts. Lena curled up with Rex beside her, fingers tangled in his fur. She thought about the past, the pain, the hunger, the fear. And then she thought about now. A warm room, a safe place, someone who had chosen to help her without expecting anything in return. And Rex, her constant, her protector, the one soul who had stayed through it all. She wasn't alone anymore. She never would be again. The night stretched on, silent and still. For the first time in what felt like forever, Lena wasn't afraid of the dark. She sat on the couch, legs tucked beneath her, a warm blanket draped over her shoulders. The apartment was quiet, except for the occasional hum of the refrigerator and the soft rustling of the wind outside. At her feet, Rex lay curled up, his body warm against her legs. His presence was steady, solid, something real in a world that had always felt like it was slipping away. Daniel sat in the armchair across from her, sipping his coffee. He hadn't said much since they came back inside, but she knew he was watching her, waiting. Finally, he spoke. "So, what now?" Lena stared into her cup of tea, watching the steam curl into the air. For so long she had never thought about what came next. Every day had been about surviving just a little longer, finding food, avoiding trouble, keeping her head down. But now she had a choice. She took a breath. "I don't know." Daniel nodded like he had expected that answer. He leaned back, stretching his legs out in front of him. "Well, no rush. You can stay here as long as you need to." Lena looked up sharply. She hesitated. "I don't want to be a burden." Daniel snorted. "Kid, you and your dog chased off a grown man today. If anything, I think I should be worried about you kicking me out." For the first time in a long time, Lena smiled. It was small, fleeting, but real. Rex shifted beside her, letting out a soft sigh. She reached down, running her fingers through his thick fur. He had been with her through everything. Through hunger, through loneliness, through fear. "I'm not going anywhere without him," she said quietly. Daniel studied her. "Yeah, I kind of figured that." A comfortable silence stretched between them, broken only by the occasional sip of coffee. Lena glanced at the door, the same door her father had walked away from just hours ago. She had spent so long thinking she could never escape him, that no matter how far she ran, he would always find her. But she had been wrong. She had won. And now, the past didn't feel like chains around her wrists anymore. It felt like something she could leave behind. She looked back at Daniel. "Why did you help me?" Daniel exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Because someone helped me once." Lena waited, but he didn't say anything more. She didn't push. She understood what it was like to carry things too heavy to speak aloud. Instead, she just nodded. Outside, the city stretched on. Cars moving, people walking, life continuing as if nothing had changed. But for Lena, everything had. She thought about the past, the cold, the hunger, the fear. She had survived it, and now, for the first time, she wasn't just surviving. She was living. She reached for Rex again, pressing her forehead against his. His tail thumped gently against the floor. "We'll figure it out," she whispered. Rex let out a soft huff, his warm breath tickling her cheek. Daniel grinned. "You already sound like a person with a plan." Lena smirked. Not a plan, just a choice. And that was enough. For the first time in her life, she was free to decide where she went next. She didn't know where the road would lead, but as long as she had Rex by her side, she knew she would never walk it alone. And that was more than she had ever dared to hope for.